Anyone familiar with working with Eastern esotericism or esotericism that originates in the East, especially India, Southeast Asia, and the outer teachings of Tibet and Mongolia and Central Asia, will be very familiar with the long time frames involved in spiritual processes. Often we talk about purifying karmas and progressing over eons. And the purification of karma from countless lifetimes is sometimes glossed over. But the time frames usually involved are very long. However, if one moves beyond the outer teachings, then suddenly there are collections of teachings which hint this may not always be the case. When I was young, much younger, about 15, 16, there was a treasure. A book was in my school library that I consider very lucky. My karma had matured. And this was The Secret Yogas of Tibet, translated by Evans Wentz, and was translated, I now understand, from the Drukpa Kagyu tradition. And in these 6 secret yogas, there was the yoga of one-pointedness, there was the yoga of the bardos, there was yoga of the psychic heat. There was a collection of these yogas, but one of them in particular was the yoga of consciousness transference. Now, in the mid-70s, living in Queensland, the likelihood of ever coming into contact with these teachings seemed distant, if nigh on impossible. In fact, it was taught both within the text and later on when I did receive teachings on this practice from several different schools and teachers within those schools, that in many places the tradition had been lost. That, for instance, it had once been practiced in India, but that it had become lost through practice. That in Central Asia, that where the practice possibly originated, that this was no longer the case. Most probably with the fall of Manichaeism and of the various Buddhist schools in Central Asia as the Islamic Empire spread out and refused to allow any other teachings but its own to coexist. And in many ways, to receive these teachings was not something that automatically happened. You had to develop a close relationship with a teacher. You had to progress through the many, many, many stages required for you to receive the door to open to these teachings because of their power and their speed. That is, the speed through which one can achieve realization. But it must be pointed out, you could also receive the world of delusion, the robes of Mara, equally as quickly. One of the reasons why traditionally people took a long time before they taught you these secret teachings. They were secret not because they were to be restricted from everyone. Ultimately, anyone could practice them. It is the ramifications of what they teach and where that can lead those of a weaker or less stable mind, namely into madness. Yet the promise of especially the teachings on consciousness transference, or Phowa, are many. One, you can achieve freedom from the cycle of rebirth in one lifetime. Now, there is a caveat to this, and we'll quickly discuss that a little bit later. But ultimately, rather than go through the path of cessation, whereby you purify karma, and those of you of a quick mind would recognize that if you are trying to purify karma from endless existence, then it's not possible to do that in one lifetime. But more importantly, every moment you exist, you are creating karma. So ultimately, you can't purify karma. So something's up. And in many ways, teachers will happily tell you this. That does not mean that the path of purification and the path of constant spiritual practice are not valuable. No. The very discipline by which we train our mind is essential to achieve at least peace, if not to open the doorway to these higher practices. And in many ways, teachings such as the secret yogas are not exclusive to any one tradition. That includes the general world of Buddhism. It is possible to use these teachings regardless of your spiritual path, because they are not connected to any ideology. Remember that within the Buddha Dharma, within most Dharma faiths, what the path is about is method, not means. Ultimately, all spiritual practice is method. That is, it gets you to a goal. And what happens when you get to the goal, you will know. What will you know? That's the rub, isn't it? You have to get there. And when one is taught practices like Phowa, those of a weaker disposition think, oh great, I know this. They may even achieve the signs and then stop practicing, thinking, I know this, I can do this. And then when the practice has to be done, and this is a point, it must be done as you are dying, so that with your last breath you eject your consciousness. That what you think, what you do in your last moments is a distillation of your whole life. And so knowing a practice like this isn't enough. You do need to do it, even if you do no other practices. Ultimately, if you focus on this one practice, then you can achieve the results. But it requires you to, as it says in the word, practice. Now, ultimately, Phowa is basically quite simple. The idea exists that there is a psychic nervous system. There are, in essence, two channels that go from our nose, go up, cross, go down, and just behind and below, around where our navel is. And they connect to a central channel which goes down from the crown of our head down to what is sometimes called the secret chakra, the base chakra. This is the space just below our genitals, between our legs. And what goes up and down, of course, are the winds. And these winds, or lung, are the things that show that we're alive. As long as these winds are moving within our psychic system, we're living. And while we can do that, we have a chance to prepare ourselves for that final ejection. And this is where practices such as the psychic heat become important, because essentially you become a chimney sweep, clearing out the channels within you, allowing the winds, allowing the energy, the prana, to move up and down freely, and to slowly prepare the brahmacharya, the chakra at the top of your head, to become clearer, so that when the time comes, you can leave through there and not through any other chakra. And this is the essence of the practice, because it is all about directing your consciousness upwards. When one engages, whether it's in guru yoga, visualizations of deities, simple practices, one works constantly to visualize the teacher, the deity, the being within whom your practice is involved, as residing at the top of your head, and directing your consciousness always that way. Does it have to be a Buddha and Bodhisattva? Well, these are terms. They denote when you move away from dogma, a Bodhisattva is a being who has enlightened wisdom, a saintly being. It could be dakinis, it could be angelic beings. It could be your teacher. It could be, if you have refuge in a text, if you have a more dogmatic background and cannot see the virtue in visualizing beings, you could see texts, you could see letters. The important thing is something within which you have meaning. You see it just above the top of your head, and you begin the process constantly of seeing it up there and directing your consciousness upwards. And in the essential practice, this is enough. And as you come to that final breath, you see yourself rising up towards the light, where you become one with the light, prima practice. And as a result, your consciousness leaves through the crown of your head, and you escape the winds of karma. You escape the cycle of birth and death, and find yourself reborn in a pure land, a heaven if you wish, the field of reeds. And in a way, you've cheated karma. But you haven't, because ultimately karma is as illusory as everything else around you. Sin, if you even look within the Gnostic Gospels, it even says this. The idea of sin is a human concept. The idea of karma is a human concept. This does not mean it does not exist. It creates an impression upon us psychically. But it does not create the prison other than our own belief in it. And sometimes, trying to purify karma, we are caught in a cycle. But in focusing upon the practice of ejecting our consciousness through the top of our head, as we begin to dissolve and return back to that stream of consciousness that is truly us, your soul, for want of a better word, that you're so focused upon this practice that the grasping and the regrets and the fears and the desires do not occupy your mind for that moment. And in that brief moment, that brief window, you are able to leave through the top. Now, this, at the basic level, is still an important process, and it is possible to achieve transference, Phowa, just by this basic concept. And there are numerous translations of texts and teachings on this available now. There are many teachers who have a living connection to the lineage, whether it goes back to India or to Central Asia, who do exist and are authorized to transmit this and have familiarity with the practice and its potential pitfalls. But as a practice, what is essential is that always you focus your consciousness upwards. And why? Well, according to many of the texts, Longchenpa I can think of, Yeshe there's quite a few of them actually, even Sadhguru Rinpoche in the Bon tradition. I've even heard Shivananda talk about this, and Satyananda have talked about this, as they seem to be aware of the practice. And this is that in the end, all we have to do is focus upon the practice and give up the desire for the goal, but also give up the grasping for what is now, but to reside in the practice. And this can be done even without conceiving of such things. If, for instance, you have an Abrahamic background, there is nothing wrong with seeing your teachers or angelic beings at the top of your head and constantly visualizing yourself climbing up. In many ways, I have heard this discussed in Kabbalah as Jacob's ladder. I know Rabbi Shachter Shalomi used to talk about this quite a bit. But ultimately, the practice itself is not that complicated. But by doing it, one then avoids rebirth in the lower realms. And these lower realms can be if your consciousness comes out through your genitals. These are in the traditional texts. You're going to the hell realms, my friend, according to the texts. And they don't have to be some Dante-esque realm. All you have to do is look on this world, and there are places you don't want to be reborn because they're a living hell. If you come through your navel, then you can gain an animal rebirth. And this has its own pitfalls. If it comes through your heart, then you can have a human rebirth. And that's like Russian roulette, really. I mean, you may have come in contact with spiritual teachings this life, but you may as easily find yourself caught in rebirth in a place where spirituality is dogmatic or forbidden. If you come through from around the throat and the third eye, then you will be reborn as a god. And this is a nice rebirth, but the possibility of spiritual practice is considered very low. And ultimately, you're just burning the candle. And at some point, the karma is going to wear out and woo, down you slide. Celestial spiritual snakes and ladders. There is, in fact, a Tibetan oracle that uses this symbolism. But if one goes through the top of one's head, one escapes this cycle. And in so doing, you are then reborn in a favorable circumstance. And with recent events in our troubled and difficult world, as much as I love this world, I fear my rebirths. I fear being sent away by my own lack of focus into another realm where the ability to benefit others is non-existent, and where spirituality and the connection to the divine is even less possible than this world. And so I practice Phowa as my own personal practice. I heartily recommend it to you. It is a simple, simple practice. And may you come into contact, and may you practice and find results, and in so doing find freedom from the cycle of birth and death in ignorance, and then return to us to share the treasures that you were able to achieve in these pure realms, and free us all from this cycle of laughter and tears, which we find ourselves very much caught up in now. I am Dr. Shimon de Valencia. I am the Merry Mystic, and I wish you success in your spiritual path. Namaste.